And if you haven't already done so, make sure that you click on resubmit, and the text box will open up, and type in the three most significant things. The vice presidency. The qualifications for the vice presidency are considered to be the same for the president. So 35 years of age, 14 years living here and a natural born citizen. I mean, what would be the point then? I mean, if they didn't meet these qualifications and the president died or resigned, then you would skip over the vice president. So it really wouldn't make much sense for it to be otherwise. The duties and responsibilities of the vice president are fairly simple within the Constitution. They simply are the president of the Senate and they cast tie-breaking votes. And that's pretty much it. And when the country enabled its second government, the constitutional republic, it was often considered by many, including President Washington, that the vice president was actually part of the legislative branch. And so George Washington didn't really include John Adams in cabinet meetings or important discussions for the most part. And so it was kind of an awkward situation. At the same time, the Senate considered the vice president kind of a spy for the executive branch, even though that wasn't the case. So Adams had a tough time navigating his role. And eventually, the vice presidency ended up being an incredibly passive position for the most part. And it wouldn't be until the 20th century when Harry Truman, not the first vice president of FDR, FDR actually had others, he became president when FDR died early in his fourth term. And of course, this involved World War II, things like the Manhattan Project, the use of the nuclear bomb, all those kinds of things that kind of surprised Harry Truman because he really didn't know a lot about all this stuff. He knew some, but wasn't informed about everything. And so it was decided at that time that the vice presidency should be included in more of the decision-making process, or at least be an observer of it, so that way they have the information firsthand. So the vice president legally is now part of things like the National Security Council, for instance, and it has to be notified of certain events, issues, and classified information. Saying that, though, doesn't really change anything, because in reality, except since maybe Al Gore and Bill Clinton in the 90s, up until then, vice presidents weren't necessarily good friends or associates or allies of the presidency. In fact, often they would be completely opposite people politically, maybe even if they were in the same party, or have different leadership personalities, and often didn't get along all the time. But for the most part, since Clinton and Gore, the situation has changed a little bit. And the reason why is because for a long time, the vice president was really picked to what we call balance the ticket. They were supposed to make up for whatever shortcomings the president had. So, for instance, Jack Kennedy was from the Northeast. He was liberal, he was young, he was wealthy. And so his former primary opponent in the nomination process, LBJ, who was from the South, he was more conservative, he had worked his way up. He was picked in order to balance the ticket, make up for the shortcomings of JFK. And even today, that's often done, even now that vice presidents and presidents get along more. Donald Trump, of course, not having any political experience, picked Mike Pence, who was a former member of the House of Representatives and governor of Indiana. So he had kind of this governmental experience to make up for any lack that President Trump might have had. And at the same time, he's also a Christian evangelical. And that makes up for things involving President Trump's personal life. So that kind of balancing of the ticket helps make the ticket more popular, more appealing, and make people say, well, this other guy's there, maybe that will help out. And so that often happens. Same thing with President Obama. He did not have nearly as much experience. He'd only been in the United States Senate, not even for one term. So they picked Joe Biden, who had decades of experience. Or George W. Bush. He had been governor of Texas, but that wasn't really nearly the extent of national government exposure that Dick Cheney had. So they tried to pick someone to try to balance out that as much as possible. The balancing of the ticket, of course, is one of the reasons why in the past they didn't get along. Jack Kennedy and LBJ didn't really like each other personally. Often LBJ would be sent out of the country and the government, the White House would send out telegraphs basically saying, please remember he doesn't represent the United States government. So even though LBJ was included in all the discussions about Vietnam and the National Security Council issues involving the Bay of Pigs and other things, he still wasn't taken seriously by the White House staff. So that really didn't change, like I said, until the 90s. But now they have more, the last few presidents have had more of a cooperative type of relationship. And hopefully that continues into the future, because obviously that doesn't make things efficient. It doesn't help set a healthy relationship for leadership, and it doesn't create a good situation if something does happen to the president. The cabinet, of course, is meant to fulfill the role of administering the 15 different departments of the United States government. The oldest, of course, being the State Department involving foreign affairs. In fact, if you see other countries, they'll have a foreign minister. That's basically the equivalent of the Secretary of State. And the newest being the Department of Homeland Security, created shortly after 9/11 to coordinate all of our security forces and intelligence information. The qualifications of this, obviously, once again, they're probably going to match them up with the presidency as best as possible, because after the vice president, the Speaker of the House, the temporary president of the Senate, then the cabinet falls in the line of succession. So they would, of course, have to be qualified to be president. They don't do that all the time. For instance, Bill Clinton's last Secretary of State was not born in the United States. And so even though she'd been a citizen since she was 3 years old, that didn't matter. So if everyone else had died before her, she would get skipped over to be president. But other than those few exceptions, they usually do meet this. What usually the president looks for is someone also has political ability, so that way they can manage the hallways of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., and be able to sit through congressional hearings and know how to deal with lobbyists and all those other kinds of aspects. Hiring an expert in the field that doesn't have any political experience often ends in disaster, because the expert might know the subject area. Like if you hired an energy secretary to run the energy department, they might know about the content, but they don't know how anything works. And so that doesn't often work well for the cabinet department or the president, because they often had to end up firing that person or ignoring them or just working through the lower level employees instead, which doesn't really help out the situation. And the cabinet duties include, of course, making sure that the cabinet department is staffed properly with the right people at the upper levels, and to make sure that the department is following the policy agenda of the president and whatever role that Congress sets out. The problem of picking people that are politically experienced, and I think I mentioned this before, is that they're politicians, they have egos, they could possibly have their own agenda. Maybe, I don't want to enact this negative policy that the president wants because I want to run for governor of New Jersey later on. And so that can often play a role in their decision making. And so the president often has to look out for this kind of thing. Sometimes presidents have to end up firing for that. Jimmy Carter had to fire one of his cabinet secretaries because they got too big for their britches and too big of an ego. And so he had to show them the door. So it depends on whether or not they're helping the administration, because they do have a media presence and they do help make an appeal for the president. Just like the vice president can balance the ticket, a diverse cabinet having people from different backgrounds can help make the president look better, that he's uniting the country. That's why many presidents, not all, but many, will hire at least one person from the other party to be a part of the cabinet. George W. Bush, President Obama both had people from the opposite party, for instance, to run at least one of the departments, and that makes it help look like you're uniting the country. So the cabinet also fulfills that type of media purpose as well. Are there any